Today we're going to begin in earnest our more close examination of Pendragon RPG, the classic and you might say timeless game where the players take on the perspective and the role of knights in the time of King Arthur. One of the places where the game sells itself is in its idea of campaign play. Sometimes the virtues and vices of a given player character knight may pull him out of the story, and that is a term of art in this game. Likewise, the game's combat system is pretty lethal. And finally, the game's idea of campaign play is intended to be spanning years of time. One of the places where the game wants to alight your imagination is in the idea of dynastic play. Characters are going to grow old, they're going to retire to their bedroom and then into the grave, and you will take up their sons, their brothers, their cousins as your new player characters. So putting all these factors together, it's pretty easy to see that the character generation system is going to be used more frequently than perhaps in other RPGs. At the same time, you're going to play several characters that you probably want to be different from one another. Some of that variety may come because in the course of the saga's unfolding, you may find occasion to play your squire, or perhaps your knight's wife, or widow, or sister. And this game's treatment of the legendary ladies of the Arthurian Legendarium is something that we will treat with in a later video. Notwithstanding that though, as I'm learning this game, one of my curiosities is how much variety can the game give between different knights? When I play a role-playing game, I often want to feel like the differences that I imagine my character has from the other players' characters are something that rise to the dignity of some numbers on the sheet. At the same time, as much as I love character creation systems that have a life path, are dice rich, and are a multifaceted building experience to reach the totality of a character, I have to acknowledge that taking that amount of time to create every character that's going to see play in Pendragon would probably lead a group to have less time actually playing the game and more time spent creating characters. So that's the question that'll be on our minds as we start creating a character here in Pendragon. How fast is character creation, and how much variety can it generate? We're going to use the simplest character creation method in the core book. It's the method that creates a Cymric young man, or woman if your group chooses to use the ahistorical gender roles options which are presented in the book. We'll talk about that another time. And this young person is about to receive their knighthood and their father's title from the Count of Salisbury in the heart of the kingdom of Logres, what is present-day southern England. From here on out, I'm going to be talking from my point of view as I walk through the character creation system a step at a time. Notably, the game begins by telling me to choose a name for the character. I don't think too hard about it, and I look at the list of period names for examples, and I choose Gilbert. I decide to play someone whose religious axis lies towards Stonehenge rather than Rome, and so I note that Gilbert is a pagan. I roll an 8 for what manor he's inherited. Gilbert is from Idmiston. As a pagan, Gilbert's virtues are lustful, energetic, generous, honest, and proud. Each pair of personality traits adds up to 20 as they're in opposition. Gilbert's virtues start at a 13, and their opposite starts at a 7. All the other traits start at a 10, but we are creating a knight of Arthurian times, and so valorous begins at 15. Next, the game asks if I would like to have a signature trait. And I say, oh, why yes, I would. And I think, wouldn't it be interesting to play a legendary knight of Arthur's time who had a deep spiritual calling, but to the old ways? With that in mind, Gilbert's spiritual trait becomes a 16, which means that in moments of drama and instinct, I'll be called upon to roll for Gilbert's spirituality. The choice between the spiritual and the worldly in those situations won't be entirely up to me, and it may be up to the dice. But I will be getting glory from that spirituality, and glory is the game's primary currency of character progression, of leveling up. Next, we note Gilbert's passions. All character knights begin the game loyal to their lord, loving of their family, with a deep-seated belief in hospitality, and their honor is the most important facet of their character that they pursue. And then we also roll 3d6 for how much they hate the Saxons. As it turns out, Gilbert hates the Saxons quite a bit. Maybe they had something to do with his father's passing. Next, we assign Gilbert's attributes. I have in my mind the image of a barrel-chested, belly-laughing, bearded young man who honors the old gods with his mirth, and who has a little bit of a twinkle in his eye, something charming to the ladies of this Arthurian realm. Between strength, size, dexterity, constitution, and appearance, I have 60 points to distribute. There are some bare minimums that I have to obey, and some maximums. I'll get 3 points bonus for free to my constitution because the people of Britain, the Cymric culture, are hale and hearty folk. I lay those 60 points across the stats in a way that lines up with the image in my mind best as I can. The game did give some pretty stern advice that for my first character I ought to have a guy that has a certain strength and size so that he won't fall over in combat, and I did obey that advice. Being a good-looking guy with an appearance of 13, Gilbert has 2 distinctive features, which I roll, getting bright eyes and big hands. Well, this fits nicely with my vision of the character. Oh, and there's some derived attributes that we need to fill in. You know, the sort of thing where you add 2 stats together and do some math on them. Next up, though, is skills. We give all the skills their beginning value for Cymric culture. I'm going to guess that later on, if I have occasion to create a character who's Welsh or Pictish or from Aquitaine, then maybe the cultural-based skill levels will be different. So starting from something besides 0 makes things a little bit quicker in this part, but also makes at least the Cymric knights a little bit more homogenous. Now begins the real meat and potatoes of character creation. I have a few dictats to follow, most notably that I can't push anything above a 15 at this point. Next, step 1. I pick one knightly skill that I excel at. I choose spear because I'd like to be good at fighting. It is a game about knights after all. Step 2, I've got 3 non-combat skills that I need to push up to a 10. This is a place where I choose to let Gilbert's spirituality tell the tale a bit. Gilbert becomes literate in Latin, perhaps from a Roman priest. Maybe he was tempted by the heroic tale of the Christ. But a voice, either from within or without, calls him back to the faith of his forefathers, and he becomes a student of fairy lore. He also studies the rites and dogmas of the pagan faith itself. Perhaps he fancies that one day in his old age he will write in Latin apologies for his pagan faith, explaining its truth. Step 4, we increase any 4 characteristics across the sheet, and if we increase a skill, it goes up by 5. I imagine that in this time in life, Gilbert tries to cleave a little bit closer to the values of his faith, and so he becomes a bit more generous. Perhaps this was owing to a natural disaster in County Salisbury, and in aiding the survivors of this disaster, he also gains a point of constitution. These are the years where he begins to spend more time outside the confines of the manor, and he becomes alert to the world. We increase his awareness skill by 5. And finally, in keeping with this tale of charity and mutual aid in tough times, I increase Gilbert's hospitality passion by 1 to 16, which is the point where I will need to start rolling for it. Now we have 10 points to distribute across skills, combat or non-combat, however we like. Perhaps, at this point, Gilbert redoubles himself to training in the martial arts. After all, if the Saxon conquest continues, then still more of the pagan ways of the Druids and Stonehenge will be lost, as the Saxon-German ways of sacred trees will take their place. With that in mind, I increase awareness to 12, the danger sense, the hairs standing on the back of your neck, ready for combat. Courtesy, one must keep the peace with one's fellow British knights, including the Christians, if one is to defeat the invader. First aid, because there are fallen on the battlefield, and Gilbert is a generous fellow. Heraldry, well, we gotta know friend from foe, don't we? And in a war council, one's advices are only heard as well as they are delivered, so I increase Gilbert's orate skill a bit. I also give his combat skills a bit of a bump, battle to 12, sword to 12, because he has to stick toe-to-toe with other sword-wielding knights that are less affectionate for the older ways of fighting. Now we're really starting near the finish line. I choose to create Gilbert as a 22-year-old knight with an extra year of experience under his belt. I luck out and roll a 6 for the extra points of skills that I disperse in this fashion. And then I increase Gilbert's pride by 1, because I think he's starting to have a vision for how his life and his honor will unfold as he assumes the title of his father in service to the Count of Salisbury. So I took a lot of care to show each step along the way, taking screenshots as I went, but how long this video is probably a bit longer than it would take to make a Pendragon character with this method. So if you found yourself out of the story because you weren't altruistic or generous enough to help with a maiden's request, if you find yourself wounded on the field of battle or deep in melancholy from betraying one of your passions, then seems like you could get right back into the game pretty quickly. With this method, you could bang out a new character and ride over the horizon as a new knight entering into the story, as we so often see in Arthurian legend. Well, how unique is this character versus other knights? I think he absolutely is. I made an early choice to be both spiritual and pagan, and it drove me down a pretty interesting path. At the same time, I modulated that as I saw that Gilbert needed to redouble himself to the martial arts, and so we learned a bit more about him that way. There's an even more detailed character creation system where you kind of roll through the lifetime of your grandfather and your father to find out where your family's place rests in the time of Uther Pendragon. And that's an entire chapter in the base book, and there is an expansion book which allows you to do this with other cultures and other parts of England. We'll talk about that in a future video. But suffice it to say, I think that if you have 5-player characters, their knights are going to be pretty different from each other, and I think that their sons, their brothers, their uncles, and cousins are going to be pretty different from those. After all, I could have chosen to be a British Christian, I could have chosen to be a Roman Christian, I could have gone down a lot of different paths, and instead I chose Sir Gilbert's path. That was the one in the Yellow Wood. I hope to play him someday. I hope this gave you a window into how quickly and how interesting it is to create a character for Pendragon 5.2 edition. Thank you. I am the Complex Games Apologist.